How to write to the end of your memoir successfully. How do I write the last chapter of my memoir? Coaching and editing clients will sometimes ask me. It's a good question because the last chapter of a memoir is your final shot at affirming your theme and at creating a satisfying and meaningful ending to the story the reader has been engaged in for perhaps 200 or 300 pages or even more. Before I go on, however, let me welcome you to the Memoir Network's Better Memoir Writing Masterclasses. For those of you who do not know me, I am Denis Ledoux. I'm a writer, I'm a teacher, and I'm a founder of the Memoir Network. I'm so pleased that you have joined me today for this masterclass. This class is brought to you by the Memoir Network's coaching services. A writing coach offers you just-in-time solutions, be it encouraging you to persevere, teaching specific writing skills, prompting you to action, or counseling you through writing blocks. Schedule a complimentary Get Acquainted session today by going to the address listed in the description of this video. Oh, and I'll also have a bonus for you at the end of this video. Now, let's begin the masterclass. Revising the last chapter is also something that I have been working with on my own childhood memoir, which, alas, is still innominate. Oh, I love that word, innominate. It means nameless, but of course you knew that. Well, actually, it's a word I didn't know until very recently. Okay, let's leave the word innominate behind and get back to writing the last chapter of my memoir. For a while now, I have been contributing to the text of the second half of my story, and the text has become a bit rambling. Without much awareness that I was doing this, I filled it with vignettes, my little darlings, as many writers refer to these vignettes, that I had forgotten to include elsewhere. Some of them I'm going to have to submit the fate that writers refer to often as killing their little darlings. The result of including these little darlings is, when I reread the last chapter of my memoir, it felt like I was not at the end of the story. The end was simply not happening in the text I had written. My memoir could not end there. In fact, it should not end there. Incredibly, the last chapter contained material that, frankly, was new and needed elaboration if it was going to be meaningful, or it was merely interesting, well, to me at least, but would it be to the reader? These little darlings distracted from the story, which was supposed to be winding down at that point. After all, the last chapter is the end of your story. The story needs to end. So, do I add another chapter, or do I weed this unkept garden of memories? Since I was at 275 pages of text, weeding out and transplanting, just to continue the metaphor of garden, seemed the better choice. It has become the time for me to release the insight to wrap up a last chapter can give to a book if it has been worked and honed to its essence. A last chapter is the wrap-up of the theme, which is, at this point, demonstrable and substantiated if you have done your work right. The theme is, frankly, the reason you wrote your memoir. Something that has been in the making since chapter 1 needs to wrap up in the last chapter. If you can get the last chapter fixed, that is, to tell how the story ends, you are in better shape to work on and revise previous chapters, especially those that make up the second half of your memoir. Now, when I watch a movie, I notice that many directors and writers can pull off the beginning of a film, but only the experienced and talented among them can pull off a satisfying ending. An ending makes or breaks a movie, as it does a memoir. I'm sure you've experienced this in movies. Lovely opening scenery, great costumes, an interesting exposition of characters, and an action that sets up a conflict. This is a great beginning, but how many movies can bring it together to a satisfying conclusion, to a great ending? Now let's say the movie you've been watching goes on, and when it finally ends, you have no solid sense of why the characters did what they did and what the story might possibly be adding up to. It just simply stops as if, well, perhaps the budget has come to an end. Huh? You go on? Your experience was, well, frankly, disappointing and unsatisfying. Here is a necessary caveat before I start making suggestions for the last chapter of your memoir. I am not advocating starting to write a memoir from the last chapter. No, this is about what to do now that you have written your entire first draft and have done substantial polishing to the first half of your book. I'm not a great believer in outlining a memoir. Instead, you do better to write many stories and to link them as you discover what your memoir is really about. That is how you find your theme, by writing. Funny thing about that, isn't it? Who would have thought that your writing itself would teach you about your memoir? But it always does. Here are my tips on how to get the last chapter of your memoir right. Tip number 1, ask what the memoir is really about. Not the who and the what, but the message your memoir is attempting to convey. When you started to write your memoir, you had a vision. While there were people you wanted to commemorate and events that you wanted to celebrate, there was also something more intangible you wanted to express. The something can usually be expressed in a few words that the memoir will expand in 200 or 300 pages or more. Perhaps you wanted to support the idea that hard work will win the day or that hard work will not win the day. Perhaps you wanted to affirm that you had experienced hard knocks, but your attitude pulled you through. Whatever the encapsulated expression of your theme, sorry about having to say this, your theme often sounds like a cliché. That is why you are writing a book, to take the theme out of the realm of the cliché and into an experience the reader will enjoy and benefit from. The last chapter of a memoir wraps up or substantiates the theme in a meaningful and convincing way for the reader. The reader must come to an end of the reading of your memoir with a sense of having had a satisfying experience. Does your memoir do this? A second reader is often necessary to really answer this question. An editor is an excellent choice for a second reader. Tip number 2. What did the character, that's usually you, do that brought the story to a climax, to a crisis, to a resolution? What was the character yearning for? What was the character heading towards throughout the memoir? And does this quest materialize into a resolution in the last chapter? A resolution that makes sense to you as the reader. In the last chapter of my own memoir, I wrap up one of the plots of my memoir. I am awarded a scholarship whose quest I had set in motion in a previous chapter. I choose a school that I want to go to. This is a high school that I'm going to. And I get accepted. And of course, there are things in between all of this. For instance, I need to tell the reader, why do I want this outcome? And what is conspiring for and against the realization of this outcome? Also, why will this outcome make a difference to me? Answers to these questions must be obvious and satisfying in the final chapter of my memoir. Many earlier chapters tell why going away to a school was important to me, and they outline the unattractiveness of the opportunities I saw in my other choices. Winning a scholarship that will pay for a residential school and being accepted are a logical and satisfying conclusion to the action and the character angst that runs through the book. I must mention that I was a first generation to go to college, and so there was something that I wanted to do that I had no model for. This also is written about earlier in the book. Everything else belongs earlier in this memoir than being placed in the last chapter of a memoir. Yes, even the vignette about our family working in the yard to clean it up after the long winter. Now, that was a really good story about pulling together, about community our family forms, about cohesion of my grandparents who lived upstairs, my parents and my siblings. And now a certain fear about leaving my nurturing family sets in, and it fits really well in a few chapters earlier where the text suggests that in spite of my ambition to go away to school, I will miss my family. In the last chapter, however, the inclusion of this vignette about our family working together dissipates the energy of that chapter, which has to be, I'm ready to go away, and I am going to go away. Tip number 3, do the episodes of the memoir, often but not always synonymous with the chapters, support the development of the theme as it wraps up in the final chapter. A memoir is not fiction, and it must tell the literal truth. Because of that, some writers feel they have to include everything that happened to them in the period of time encompassed by the memoir. No, you must omit what does not support the theme. Here's a made-up example that might give clarity to this. You might have learned figure skating during the time of the memoir, which is, however, devoted to acquiring financial freedom. Now, if this is your memoir, and if figure skating did not contribute to your learning financial skills, you do not need to mention the skating lessons in your book, nor of your increasing competence. In fact, were I to edit your book, I might recommend either omitting it entirely or tying it more closely to your theme if that's possible. Here's tip number 4. Really polish the text of the second half of your memoir. My writing clients always polish the first half of their text so much more than the second half. Well, I do the same. But the second half deserves just as much polish as your first half. After you have written and polished the last chapter, go back to other chapters of the second half of the book to polish them and make sure they contribute to the last chapter's satisfying wrap-up and that they're well written. Now, my asking you to wrap up does not mean I am implying you need to make everything neat and orderly. No, a wrap-up can be as simple as, and now I awaited the next phase of my life, knowing there would be challenges and I might not succeed, by knowing also that I was ready for that change. Of course, it could take you a whole chapter to show that, to say that in an interesting way. Well, we've reached the end of this video master class. I've offered you a few solid suggestions for writing the last chapter of your book. If you follow these suggestions, these tips, you will likely avoid the fate of memoirs and movies that have great beginnings but do not know how to come to an end. Of you, people will say, this was a good writer who knows how to end a book. That's a very important thing for the reader to be able to say about you. If you would like to explore receiving help with ending your memoir or any aspect of memoir writing, know that we offer a 30-minute complimentary get-to-know-you coaching consultation. Oh, and before you go, here's the bonus I promised you, a link to our video, 10 Secrets to Getting Your Memoir Done Right. It is a recording of an interview I did recently. It will help you both to write your memoir and to edit it once it is written. Now remember, inch by inch, it's a cinch. Yard by yard, it's hard. Good luck writing your stories.